Good morning. This morning on Candid Conversations, I'm joined by Chris Wee and Bob Waits. So I'll start with a few introductions. My name's Maddie Lowry. I'm an Associate Director at Cheshire and Wirral NHS Foundation Trust. Um, I am also part of Candid. Chris, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, thanks, Maddie. So I'm Chris Wee. I'm a child psychiatrist, also working at Cheshire and Wirral Partnership NHS Trust in the Children's Autism and ADHD Assessment Team across Cheshire. I'm also part of CANDDID, and with CANDDID, I get involved in very co-production work and with sort of very clinical research about services for children who are neurodivergent. So that's me.
And Bob, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, of course. So I'm Bob Waits. I am a learning disability nurse within the community team in the Wirral, also part of CANDDID, part of some research projects at the moment ongoing with CANDDID, and have the pleasure of working with Danny Acton, who's one of our other members of staff. Yeah, we can cut
Okay.
all these bits. We're all good. We're all good. The main thing with this is what I found, and I know I'm talking now, is just like be as relaxed as possible, because I think you move away from the interview side, don't you, and just kind of have a conversation.
So, Chris and Bob, I know that you were part of a team that went over to Belgium recently to take part in a European conference. So, Chris, would you like to start by telling us where you went and what you were doing over there?
Yes, so we went to Ghent, which is a really, really lovely, actually, student town in Belgium, and it was for the 15th biannual European Conference of the European Association for Mental Health and Intellectual Disability. So we were there as part of there was a group of us from Candid went there. We were actually running about 3 workshops between us. So Bob and Danny probably will be able to talk more about the project that I was helping them present workshops on. So there was a project, MCAMP-ID, or the Brave Project, which was looking at anxiety, interventions for anxiety, co-produced with people of intellectual disability. Um, we were also presenting a general workshop on co-production and how Candid co-produces its research and teaching in general with people of intellectual disability. And um, some of our colleagues were also there to present on research looking into data across Northwest England on inpatient data, looking at people of intellectual disabilities and data from their inpatient admissions. It was great, and we did a couple of interviews out there. We got to interview the 2 co-chairs of the conference, which
Yeah,
is great.
Florian
Yeah,
and Philippe, wasn't it? Yeah.
yeah.
It was really good. I think the nice thing was, I mean, for myself, I haven't traveled that much. Being given the opportunity to go and travel was absolutely fantastic. And I think you're right, the sort of the student vibe that came from the city was really interesting. Obviously hosting a conference like this in the middle of that city was absolutely brilliant. Traveling there was interesting, but I think that was part of the process, really. But I think first impressions, the city was really done justice for the conference, really, wasn't it? I think everything was set up immaculately, and kind of the conference wise really went well, didn't it? So yeah, it was a very good opportunity.
So there were a couple of things that you guys have talked about since you came back about the organisation of the conference and the co-production with people with lived experience at the conference. So when you walked into the conference, what happened?
Bob, do you want to
Yeah. I
describe?
think, yeah. So obviously the conference itself was in a huge sort of quite imperial looking building, to be honest, very sort of, concrete building, very strong
Mm.
structure. But as soon as you walked in, you hit this massively sort of relaxed vibe. I'm pretty sure everyone in the background wasn't relaxed, but nonetheless it gave the impression that it was quite a relaxed vibe, a really good sort of process, sort of checking in and everything. But we literally walked into the first sort of introduction to the conference. Everyone was up out the chairs, singing, dancing. And I think the thing that struck me the most, bearing in mind this was a co-produced conference, was the fact that people were just everywhere. people with an intellectual disability, physical disabilities, the people that were presenting, everybody was just connected, and it was so nice to see. There was no differences in how people were sort of presented within this, and the whole co-production side when we met with Gloria and Philippe was just absolutely fabulous. You know, the vibe that you got, this sort of really warm feeling of togetherness, instantly hit.
I really like the fact that, yeah, people with intellectual disability were very front and center. Uh, yeah, it's true. I think they had they called it, they had an opening ceremony, didn't they? And a closing ceremony. And we kind of walked in to the opening ceremony. I think there was folk music and singing and guitars going on. Kind of really like the fact that they had two joint chairs between Gloria and Philippe. Um, Obviously one of them with intellectual disability, and that there was it's a very joint opening of the conference. Actually, it felt like, and they were up front on the stage talking about how it was co-developed and things.
So that was one of the things that we talked about after you guys came back, and in fact, we were texting during the course of the conference for those of us who didn't get to go to Ghent. And we were reflecting on our own events, particularly our scientific conference, and thinking about how we might actually take some of that learning and bring that back home. So just in thinking about the way that we do things, what do you think we should do differently?
So, so, so my thoughts were, and this is great. I think Bob, us and Danny were talking about this. It was quite interesting that we have a stakeholders conference, which is very focused in co-production, and we have a scientific conference. But what I did notice was that I think our scientific conference is very much also there's an ethos of co-production. There's an ethos. A lot of the research tends to be very neuroaffirmative and co-produced. So I think one thing we already do well, actually, is that I think the ethos between our scientific conference and the co-production stakeholders conference already feels in sync. Whereas I think the good thing was that the structure and the framework was very co-produced, co-developed. People of ID up in front, chairing the workshops themselves and be introducing the speakers. Some of the content of the workshops itself, from the scientific point of view, was still I think they were a slightly
Technical, wasn't it?
earlier.
Still quite
Yeah,
technical.
it was very technical. They were an earlier point in their co-production journey. I think there was some of the workshops are still very much about the pathology and deficit terminology and framework. So those are things where I think CANDDID is doing very well already. The scientific content. The things that we could take away, I think, were things like, I had the feeling that there was co-production, co-development about conference from the start. Don't you think, Bob? I had a feeling they probably had people on the committees from the start involved in the planning of the conference.
Yeah, I think the fact that when we spoke to Glorian, who was the gentleman with intellectual disability, he was absolutely front and center. He was managing things. He was running around. He had, he thankfully took the time to speak to us for a period of time, but you could see he was clearly busy. And I think that was the really nice thing. Sort of, he described sort of the weight off his shoulders once the conference had sort of taken place and had started to go ahead, and it was really well done. But he was very clear that there was no point where they were not in conversation together. I think they'd clearly spent nights sat together discussing how things were going to look. There was no sort of, this is the idea we've got, what do you think about it? It was very much, what is our idea? And I think that's something anywhere can take, is asking the question of what's our idea, rather than this is what we've got the idea of, let's see how we can fit you into it. But I think the really good thing you were saying about the in the actual presentations, people were introducing those presentations, it just felt so seamless. So there was people kind of, we were preparing for one of our presentations, and kind of looking around, getting ready in the room and things like that, and this lady came in to speak to us and said, I'm going to be hosting your session and introducing you. And she did such a fantastic job, but it just came so naturally. Like, she just came in, told us exactly what to do. We were stood there not quite knowing what to do, and she just gave us all the guidance. And I think it was the fact that, you know, it was just so seamless that I think it stitched together so well, didn't it? That you kind of just felt so engrossed for the entire time of being there in the lives of people with lived experience. It was you were part of that lived experience almost. It was
That
fantastic.
definitely, and I think it very much came across the theme of the conference, like the talents, talking about talent, the way they themed it, their big keynote speech, which is very about being neuroaffirmative, about talent and what things that everyone um have, no matter what, no matter who you are, where you come from, that really felt co-produced and really upfront, kind of.
It sounds
Yeah.
it sounds when you're talking, it sounds that you both came away quite empowered by this,
Mm.
by
Oh,
by
absolutely. Yeah.
by the way in which, um, uh, you know, people with lived experience were just a seamless part of it and were able to stand up, to be independent, to be able to present, to have confidence. And I think that's something that we would want to aspire to, actually. Absolutely.
Yeah, definitely.
So part of the conference was to showcase research that was happening across Europe in the field of intellectual disabilities. What did you think about? I'm sure that you went to different sessions because my understanding of this conference is it's really big and they've got lots of
Huge.
concurrent sessions happening at the same time. So, what did you? Depending on where you went, what was your impression of co-production in that research? Chris, do you want to go
Yeah.
first?
I think actually our impression was that actually Candid is actually probably much further than we think in the co-production
Yeah.
journey and our journey of getting it right. So it was quite interesting at the co-production workshop we sort of, Danny, Bob, myself, sort of did on the Saturday. Um, we sort of said, we know we're not perfect, we know we're learning, we're on a journey. And it was really interesting, the feedback we got in the sort of group work part was that wow, actually people wanted to be where we were and felt that they were at a much earlier stage, actually.
Mm.
And I think Danny got pulled into giving a lot of advice about how some
Yeah.
big research projects have been co-produced. I think so. I think also methodology wise, and probably I think Bob, probably Danny spoke a lot about this as well. Um, we are much less. We are much sort of more embedded with co-production, with real co-production from the start in our research, and probably further ahead than we realised there. Don't you think, Bob?
I think some of the things that came in the co-production workshop was the questions being asked about, yeah, how do we actually get people in the door to involve them, was some of the
Mm.
questions that were being asked, which I think the idea of co-production to us is that involvement from the start, which is what we recognize the conference has, is it was built around people with lived experience being involved from the beginning. But I think definitely some of the questions that came, but also some of the presentations, the conversation around co-production, it was almost having people with lived experience involved in any way was
Mm.
seen to be that level of co-production where some people were at. So when I mean that, I could mean actually when you're delivering an intervention, they were involved in that intervention. So they were having an intervention delivered to them. It felt at
Yeah.
times that things were being delivered to rather than delivered with. And
Yeah.
I
Interesting.
had a conversation with one of the speakers around, they were talking about how we can adapt something for an individual within like a group home setting. And I sort of asked the question of would you sit down with that individual and have that conversation with them? And it, at this particular moment, it was almost like there was a spark of ingenuity, and there was a couple of people in the room that sort of had, it was a really good conversation around it, really. And whereas to me, I felt like that might be our sort of basic level of practice. There was aspects of it that were integrated into how people were presenting, but also there was aspects where it seemed like quite an alien concept in some ways. Co-production seemed to be
Definitely.
interchanged with sort of just involvement almost. It didn't necessarily seem to
Yes.
be the same sort of terminology, really. Not in all cases. But yeah,
That's
definitely
true.
some. Yeah.
We definitely got challenged, didn't we? That was
Mm,
very interesting, some of the different perspectives. I think in sort of yours and Danny's NCAMP-ID sort of workshop, we definitely there was a bit of challenge, wasn't there,
yeah.
from some parts of the audience at the end about isn't including so part of that research was including a menu of strategies to manage with anxiety that had been co-produced with people of intellectual disability. And one of the strategies were things like distraction techniques and deep breathing and relaxation techniques. It was quite interesting. We were pushed back because on a theoretical basis and based on mainstream, well, actually based on some small mainstream studies, there's also a view that actually distraction and breathing and relaxation in itself are forms of avoidance, and we should be making people face their anxieties without those strategies. And then that was very interesting because the discussion was actually we shouldn't be asking people to put forward those things. We should be looking at the evidence base, not co-producing for that sort of intervention. And also that led to a discussion as well that when you start to think about it, but within the neurodiversity paradigm, which is all about society being much more person-centered and giving reasonable adjustments, then when do reasonable adjustments start and avoidance, colluding with avoidance begin? Because by that argument, many reasonable adjustments would be called encouraging avoidance. So it's very interesting.
Yeah.
And
Different parts of Europe are at different stages in thinking about the whole concept, actually.
and thinking about that in terms of actually, if these are strategies that help somebody engage
Hmm.
in a therapeutic environment or in a therapeutic course of action, even as small building blocks that enable them to then take a next step, then why would we choose to avoid those, particularly if people are saying to them, to us, this is an important part of
Yeah.
getting me to engage with this.
Yeah. It's
Absolutely.
on the bus, kind of. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think that's the whole, I mean, that in particular for Brave, as we were presenting on that, the whole foundation to that was a co-produced development. It was designed around people's views, so I think it was very interesting, and I don't feel like it was reflected by the mass within the room as well. There was certainly a feeling that almost the conversation we'd had and the presentation we'd given was kind of, was a good viewpoint to
Yeah.
take, and it seemed to be kind of well met with the majority of the group. But yeah, it was very interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think one of the other things I noted from a co-production perspective, one of the other services was talking about the access to service, for example. So difficulty with a lot of services in access to a service. So one was talking about having somebody within their team who is employed to kind of read through their leaflets, for example, and say whether or not they were, suitable for sort of that individual, whether they felt like those with lived experience out in the community may be able to sort of take on board the information that was within there. So I thought that was really interesting. It was very celebrated in that session, and a lot of other teams, services and areas seem to say, oh, actually, that's something that we think we should take on board, which I think we are definitely beyond that point with ourselves in our trusts, in CWP and with CANDDID as well, because we do have those conversations with people. We are very out there with sort of saying how can we meet the needs of those that use our service, really. So I think that was very interesting. And certainly I think that was reflected in a couple of the sort of sessions that we sat in on. One though that came to mind for me, there was a gentleman, an autistic gentleman who was a part of a research piece, and he was talking about his involvement, and he was an academic himself. He very clearly knew his data and clearly knew the information he was talking about, and I think it was fantastic because the way his presentation was received by the group was just very interesting. Received fantastically, obviously, but what I found interesting was like the questions that came to him. His answers were so fluently brilliant that the majority of other speakers really struggled to kind of, it took a second to process that question and answer. He had the answers almost as if he knew the questions. It was fantastic to see. So I think more of an observation really than anything, but it was just, I think for me it was the fact that we were in a conference that was talking about being co-produced, and I can say it categorically did what it said it was going to do, which was to give everybody the experience of that co-produced sort of
Yeah.
environment. But there was no accessibility issues. There was no issues around people not feeling involved and things like that. I think personally, I just think as an experience, it was brilliant. I think I
Yeah.
haven't seen something like that in that way before, on such a mass sort of scale. But
It was, yeah, it was a quite a big scale conference, wasn't it? And there was some really good workshops and some lovely research from the experience of siblings who have older siblings who or younger siblings who go into residential regularly or go into placements, and some really important scoping reviews about the importance of actually looking at all the different subgroups, intellectual disability, people of autism, when it comes to sort of evidence about helping them with mental health issues and outcomes. So there was some really interesting workshops, actually. Yeah, and it was a really, really well run conference. It's quite amazing in that respect.
There was another thing that I think stuck out to both of us, and we talked about this on the way back, didn't we? Was the fact that
Yeah.
so Glorian, who was as we said, was one of the sort of co founders, producers, was dual linguistic, and it was something that was really quite poignant to me. Was that there's definitely, I think there's a difference in approach of that. So he was talking about, the fact that sort of like they learn several languages. It's not unusual to sort of, in his situation, to sort of learn, more than one language. It wasn't uncommon for him. He felt like it was something that, comes quite naturally to him. And I suppose if you're in that environment where it's a natural sort of way of learning, he's learned two languages sort of adjacent to each other. But I think the thing for me was that at times there's question around someone with an intellectual disability and an ability to be dual linguistic, for example. And I think that was something that was really poignant to me, certainly for ourselves in this country, is that I don't think I've come across that many people that are dual linguistic, that have got an intellectual disability, and I just found it quite fascinating, really, and something really that I've sort of reflected on quite a bit since coming back. Really, I think it was brilliant personally. I think, but a lot of the people that were there were the same, weren't they? I think
But I think that's an issue, that's a cultural issue, particularly in Belgium. I mean, if you go to Belgium, and certainly when I've been to Belgium, the waiter will speak English, French, and Dutch normally. And that's just a waiter. Whereas if you think if the main population is often duo or trilinguistic,
Yeah.
then it's actually not a surprise if that's an expectation. Whereas I think in the UK, certainly, um, we're a bit afraid of foreign languages. And I just called them foreign languages, not other languages, didn't I? And that's something about the culture here,
Yeah,
that I think we're not brought up to embrace that. That's not necessarily true in Wales, because in Wales people often speak both languages. But I think it's more of a cultural issue in the UK. I just want to talk a little bit about ways of getting people involved in co-production, because what you have both reflected is that at that conference, there were some really brilliant bits of co-production, and then there were other people or other people involved who maybe hadn't embraced co-production in the same way. So if we were going to give some people some tips about how you can get people involved in research, or in thinking about research topics, from a co-production perspective, have you got any advice for people who might be listening, around how to step your toe into that if you haven't done it before?
So I think probably one of the advantages we have at CANDDID compared to some of the teams at the conferences. I noticed quite a few of the teams come from universities and academic centres, and I think CANDDID being very much a part of the National Health Service um, means we're right in it with the people who are using our services, with the people that we're serving and trying to help get improve get their goals, improve their health outcomes. So I think something about being in that health service and actually having that culture, which is about working with our patients, working with the people that use our services, about how our services should look, about research, about evaluating our services. I think that's something we have an advantage, and that the more we build into our services, I think the better it makes those services, because something about that culture of not of being transparent, about working in partnership and co-production, which actually makes a health service better in the first place. So I think that was my initial thought from being at the conference.
I think on that as well, if others say there's gaps in services, there's gaps in things that, you know, when care is provided for people, there's always gaps. No matter where you are, there'll be something
Yeah.
that needs filling, basically, or there's a service that needs looking at. And I think it's identifying those gaps and then finding the people that those gaps don't meet,
Yes.
and actually then asking that question of, how do you think you could cross our threshold? Because we
Yes.
have a threshold that's welcoming, but there are still people that don't cross it. And what is it
Yeah.
about not being able to cross that actually it is what's the barrier? You know, sometimes the simplest of questions can be the way to engage somebody, and you find that, you know, you ask that question and it'll probably not be something that we thought. It'll be something, you know, we were talking at the conference with one of the speakers around, uh, it was a big thing, for example, to put a ramp at the front of a building. So what we would consider to be a reasonable adjustment, it seemed like it was a huge thing to put a ramp at the front of a building. But what was interesting was that we were discussing, okay, you've put the ramp in front of the building, but those people that would have used the ramp still can't actually get to your service because there's no transport that gets to that front door. So you're still going to miss that group. It's great you've put a ramp at the front of your building, but how do they get to you? You know, you're not in an area with that's easily accessible. You're up a path, let's say, that isn't. So there's all those extra follow-ons, isn't there? So I think for me it's just about, and we do have an advantage. You're absolutely right in the fact that we've got clinical aspects, so we're able to talk to people and get that feedback. But I just think it's just be at the level of people and ask that question and just say, what is it that you think we could do, and how do you want to do it with us? I think that's the thing.
But I think the really good point as well, the other point you've raised, Bob, is actually asking the people who don't access our services, because with the way things have gone, many of our services thresholds are getting higher and higher, and it's very often the people who can't access our services, who don't fit in our boxes, they still sort of will be, negotiating daily life, accessing, having health issues. So actually asking those people, and I think to sort of be able to approach those people, I think it's about developing sort of longer term trusting relationships with probably community organizations as well, in the charity sector and in the voluntary sector, and I think developing that trust, actually, so we can have this ongoing relationship. Because sometimes I think the other thing that happens with co-production, I guess, in our health systems is it, we can be asked things at very, very short notice. We can be asked for co-production involvement at very short notice, when we're actually trying to develop services, when very often our public health services are asked to put in plans and projects and bid. And obviously nowadays research and bids for service development should be co-produced. But I guess it's avoiding that co-production being very, very tokenistic because it's so last minute. And I think if we have ongoing trusting relationships we developed over time with organizations that represent our community, that we can almost together be knowing in advance what we should be thinking about when co-producing research, what questions the community want answered, what service sort of delivery models the community wants. So I think, yeah, that thing about the people who aren't accessing our services, I think that's a really brilliant point, actually.
I think the balance, sorry, the balance of power thing as well, isn't it? It's
Yes.
about trying to you know, when you talk about, and I think this is where that sort of you mentioned sort of tokenistic, but I think this is where that can come into play, is that, you know, if you don't balance that power
Mm.
correctly, then it isn't co-production. And I think that's where, you know, again, we've mentioned it, but the conference was balanced power. There was no one that would phone Philippe that wouldn't phone Glorian. There was no one that wouldn't ask either of them the same question. It was very, there was a huge, there was Zen balance there, really, wasn't there? I think so. I think for me, it is, you know, go and find those people that don't access that service, and
Yeah.
do work with them on it, and make sure that you know, we do make sure that that is, you know, the same is given in one hand as given in the other. And I think it's just about trying to balance that, really. I think sometimes when you try and enter into co-production, it can be a little bit off-putting for the people that you're trying to involve, because it sounds like you're coming at them with a plan rather than wanting to plan with them.
Yeah.
So I think that might, it's probably a language thing and how we sort of communicate that across to people. But yeah, I think there's definitely that aspect of that power balance is so important.
I think that's a really interesting reflection, actually, from both of you, in terms of thinking about if you're into academic research, you need to spend time in the third sector environment, building up those community relationships, getting to understand people, getting them to understand what you're about, so that you have that trusted relationship
Mm.
that enables you to do co-production from the beginning. And I think that's an incredibly important point. We naturally do that a little bit more because we're providing a health service
Yeah.
perspective. But equally, we've all learned that there is a power shift in that relationship, and we need to ensure that people feel very much in control of their journey when they're accessing health and care services. And there's a lot of work that we do, within our organization, but other community teams will do the same work, and inpatient teams in these services will do the same work to make sure that the individual accessing care and treatment is in the driving seat, has information with which they can make their own decision if they have capacity to decide, but that any decisions are made in their best interest if they don't have capacity to decide. And I think that's really important. Um, so I think what we're saying is it's about getting into a community, but it's about having a longer term relationship with that community so that you can build those relationships, and then you can use those relationships to help you with co-design and co-creation of research.
Yes.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay. So if we think about some of our co-production events that we've run within Candid, I just wonder whether you've got any reflections about how they have helped us shape what we do in Candid. Um,
So
Chris?
I think, yeah, so I think the big thing for me is that the research questions that Candid looks at, and especially some of the big research projects that Candid's involved with, that those questions have been formulated and have come from our stakeholder events. So they've really come from the community. So they're really all very based in real world, sort of coping with the real world, things that are important in day-to-day living. And it obviously, biological research is really, really important. Um, but I think we know there's been some studies done that there can be a bit of a funding imbalance, that actually biological research does get a lot of funding, but actually some of the research into the more of the experience managing, solving the problems of managing daily living, daily functioning, tends to get less funding actually than the other types of research. So I think that co-produced research about the things that really matter to our population, our community, getting those, we've got a bank of those research questions that we're looking at and gradually working through in terms of grants and funding and things. I think that's one of the things that have come out of our stakeholder events that I think is really, really important and part of the core of Candid as well.
Yeah, I think
Yeah.
that's the whole ethos of Candid is the togetherness, isn't it? Really, that's we're here with people for people. So yeah, I think that shines through really. I think with the events that are held, and definitely the feedback that comes from that, as you say, is then used to sort of fuel the future research that's there. But I think the main thing is it's relevant research, isn't it? So it's up to date in how it's presented. We know that for people with an intellectual disability, people, autistic people, that there are health inequalities. We know that. What I think Candid is trying to do is answer the so what. That's the most important thing to do, is to actually look at, okay, we know this information. What do we do with it?
Yeah.
And that's the bit that I think we are all people with lived experience ourselves. We've experienced things. We have relatives that have got experience themselves, and I think we're all passionate and engaged. And I think that's the thing for me. We're not doing research for research purposes. We're doing research for people and research for forward in the future, really. So I think for me, the passion sort of comes through, and that's one of the most important things. I think if you're not behind what you're working on, the passion's not there. It's very difficult to research some of these topics without that sort of passion and drive. So I think certainly my experience coming into Candid and seeing that side has been that everybody drives with passion and sort of, their own sort of time ultimately. Yeah, it's very heavily invested in.
Oh, that's a lovely thing to say. I want to chuck in a last question that you're not expecting. So, so you guys went to Belgium. Belgium is full of lovely food. So I'd like you both to think just quickly, what was the nicest thing you got to eat whilst you were over in Belgium at this conference?
Well, I'm gonna talk a bit about what one thing that you're gonna cut out from this podcast, so don't worry about it. But I think the best thing for me, hands down, I didn't have to eat it, but Danny did, was the famous Bicky burger. Now, a Bicky burger, I sort of midway through Danny eating this found out that it's derived from horse meat, and the facial expression of Danny after finding out that he'd eaten this quite traditional food in that area was one that was quite interesting. It's going to stick with me for a while. It was very good. You can absolutely cut that bit out of the podcast, but just wanted it there for evidence.
Well, we might have to keep that one in.
Yeah. I think
To put it in context, it was quite. Our journey there deserves another podcast in itself. So by this time, it was probably about 1 or 2 in the morning, in a very busy, buzzing square in the middle of Guinness. By the time we got there, so and it did kind of make the journey. It made the whole journey worthwhile.
Yeah,
actually,
I thought we were all a little bit delirious
we
by
were
this
all
point,
very
weren't we?
happy when we found out.
I mean, I think honestly, the actual Belgium itself is stunning. I think from as a city, I think every single one of us said we'd absolutely love to go back from a leisure perspective, because the sites that were there, even just walking through what would be your sort of main sort of city centre, really was just stunning. If you carried on looking down as you were walking, there was cobbled streets around you. There was shops on the side that were quaint. There was individual sort of businesses that were set up. One was selling like sort of, they'd repurpose things like trumpets and bicycles into sort of really nice lights or chairs, and it's so surreal. But then all you had to do was look up slightly and you saw history just sort of mapped in front of you. It was phenomenal. The different styles building that were there, the architecture was stunning. I think the shout out's got to go to the Belgium chocolate. Ultimately was probably from the food perspective. I'm a big fan of some chocolate, so I think a bit of Belgium chocolate would have been a
Belgian
good
chocolate was amazing. Actually, it was amazing. It was an excellent restaurant. The whole of the Candid gang ended up at one night, and I can't remember what it's called. That was excellent as well. But the Belgian chocolate was a real standout.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Have you got any final thoughts for us before we wrap up today?
I think that, like Bob said, it was a really, really amazing experience actually, and quite different from your usual academic conference.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think for me, not so much a reflection just on that, but I think in general is just kind of keep curious. Always
Mhm.
ask why, always say so what, and always look at how we can continue to improve. Really, I think
Yeah.
for me, that's every conference should bring you back buzzing. That definitely did, but I think
Yeah.
what may create buzz for you on the way out needs to then be shown in practice. And I think that's the big thing for me is let's make sure that we use what we've learned there to actually move forward and make a difference for people.
And yeah, I think acknowledging as well, it was quite interesting. One of the workshops was about they used the theory created by an individual psychologist in sort of educational and residential settings to create this whole way of thinking about the relationships between staff and teachers and the people in those placements in a much more person-centered, a different way of less unpunitive way. And actually they had reached through that framework a lot of the practice that we do in our services, but from a completely different direction. So it was really interesting some of the different ways people come to the same conclusions or develop practice and philosophies and ways of working.
Okay.
Really good. Really good.
Great food for thought. Thank you for joining us today for a candid conversation, and we will see you soon. Take care.
Yeah. Thank you very
Thanks
much.
very much.